Please leave a comment where you are watching from. After Clara and I got married, we moved into a modest bungalow on a quiet cul-de-sac in a sleepy suburb just outside of Denver. The house itself was nothing to write home about, single story, 2 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, but it sat on a generous lot with towering pines and thick hedges that gave it a sense of seclusion. We picked that house because of the backyard, honestly. Clara dreamed of a garden, and I wanted a space to build a workshop eventually. And with a second bedroom, we were already thinking ahead about starting a family. The neighborhood was peaceful, almost idyllic. The homes were old but well kept, each with its own character. Children played in the street during the day, and by evening, you could hear the occasional bark of a dog or the hum of a lawnmower. It was the kind of place where people still waved to each other from their driveways and brought over casseroles when someone moved in. We hadn't even fully unpacked when Mr. Howard, the man who lived across the street, came over to introduce himself. He was in his early 70s, maybe older, and walked with a slight stoop that made him look shorter than he probably was. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and he wore khakis with a tucked-in shirt and a navy blue cardigan. He reminded me of a retired librarian, or maybe a former professor. The kind of person who still read the newspaper with his morning coffee. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said with a warm smile. He held out a plate of lemon bars, which he explained his late wife used to make. "I'm not much of a baker, but I try," he said. Clara and I thanked him, and we stood chatting in the driveway for a while. He told us he used to co-own a small construction firm, but sold his stake years ago to work at a used bookstore downtown. "Didn't pay much," he said with a chuckle. "But I got to spend my days surrounded by old books and interesting people." I liked him immediately. Maybe it was because I never really had a grandfather growing up, and Mr. Howard, who insisted we call him George, had that same kind of gentle wisdom about him. Over time, we built a genuine friendship. He'd invite us over for dinner every few weeks, and we'd do the same. He shared stories from his past, his travels, and the books he loved. Clara adored him too, and we both felt lucky to have such a kind neighbor. One Friday evening, we were having dinner at George's place. He'd made pot roast and roasted vegetables, and the house smelled amazing. The table was neatly set, classical music playing softly in the background. He even opened a bottle of wine from a vineyard he'd visited in Oregon years ago. It was one of those evenings where everything felt just right, good company, good food, and the comfort of familiarity. While the roast was still in the oven, I excused myself to use the restroom. George's house had the same layout as ours, more or less, so I walked down the hall toward the bathroom. As I passed his office, I noticed the door cracked open and the soft glow of a laptop screen inside. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe something just felt off. I glanced over my shoulder to make sure no one was watching, then slowly pushed the door open. The laptop was open on the desk, screen still on. I told myself I'd just look for a second, just enough to satisfy whatever strange itch had come over me. I sat down at the desk, feeling my heart beat a little faster. I clicked into the browser history first. Nothing unusual, news sites, a few gardening forums, weather. No social media. No red flags. Then I opened his photo folder, thinking maybe I'd find old pictures of him traveling or some black and white photos of his youth. At first, that's what I saw. A few old snapshots of George in his 20s, standing in front of a motorcycle, smiling with a group of friends. Then I noticed a folder labeled Evenings. I clicked on it. The images loaded slowly. The first few were dark, grainy photos of houses, our street, to be exact. I could see our house in several of them, taken from across the road. The timestamps were late at night, 2:14 a.m., 3:47 a.m. At first, I thought maybe he was documenting something like a neighborhood watch sort of thing. But the longer I scrolled, the stranger it got. There were dozens of photos, then hundreds. All of them were of our house, taken from slightly different angles, mostly at night. Some were taken from the sidewalk, others from the side of the house. I recognized the outline of our living room curtains. In one photo, Clara's silhouette was visible through the sheer fabric, standing in the kitchen. My stomach turned. I kept scrolling, unable to stop. There was one from our backyard. Another from right outside our bedroom window. One photo showed our bedroom with the lights off, but the faint outline of our bed was visible. Then I saw it, a picture taken from inside our room. The angle was unmistakable. The camera had been positioned at the foot of our bed. We were both asleep. I froze. My mouth went dry. My hands trembled as I moved the cursor to the next image. Another shot of us sleeping. Then another. George had been inside our house while we were asleep. I felt sick. I slammed the laptop shut and stood up so fast the chair nearly tipped over. I walked back down the hall in a daze. Clara and George were chatting at the table when I returned. Clara was laughing at something he said. She had no idea. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I just walked over to her, grabbed her hand, and pulled her up from the chair. "What's wrong?" she asked, alarmed. "We have to go now," I said. George looked surprised. "Is everything all right?" I didn't answer him. I didn't even put my shoes on. I pulled Clara out the front door and across the street to our house. She didn't resist. She knew me well enough to sense something was terribly wrong. Once inside, I locked the doors and shut every window. I told Clara everything, what I saw, the photos, the one of us sleeping. She didn't cry, but her face went pale. We packed overnight bags and drove to a motel on the other side of town. Neither of us slept that night. The next morning, we called a real estate agent. Within 3 weeks, the house was sold. We didn't tell our neighbors why we were moving. We just told them Clara got a job offer in Boulder, and we had to move quickly. We left no forwarding address. I never saw George again. We didn't confront him. We didn't call the police. Maybe we should have. But honestly, I was afraid. If he'd been in our house while we slept, what else was he capable of? Would he retaliate if we accused him? We just wanted to get away. The summer I turned 9, my sister and I spent 3 weeks at our grandparents' house in Central Florida. They lived in a quiet, sun-bleached community just outside of Lakeland, a neighborhood built in the 70s, with faded pastel homes, retired couples who watered their lawns every morning, and streets so still during midday that you could hear the buzz of cicadas echoing off the pavement. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen. We loved it. My sister, Rachel, was 11 at the time and already thought she was too old to play pretend with me, but we still found ways to have fun. Our grandparents' backyard opened to a small canal, and we'd spend hours skipping rocks or looking for turtles along the edge. There was a dog named Marley who lived 3 houses down, and we'd often go out of our way just to walk past the yard and see if he was out, wagging his tail and barking like we were old friends. Across the street from my grandparents' house lived a man named Mr. Greeley. That's what everyone called him, Mr. Greeley. I never heard a first name. He was tall, painfully thin, with white hair combed flat to his scalp, and a pair of oversized glasses that made his eyes look too big for his face. He wore the same thing every day, slacks that were too short and a pale blue shirt buttoned all the way up, even in the heat. He lived alone, as far as we could tell. His garage door was always closed, and his windows were covered with thick, yellowed blinds. But every afternoon around 2 o'clock, he'd come outside and sit on a plastic lawn chair at the edge of his driveway, sipping something from a glass and watching the street like a hawk. The first time he spoke to us, it was about Marley. Rachel and I were walking back from the canal, still damp from the afternoon rain, when we saw Mr. Greeley standing at the end of his driveway, holding a paper towel in one hand and waving us over with the other. "You kids like that dog, don't you?" he said, smiling just wide enough to show his yellow teeth. We stopped. Rachel gave a polite nod. "His name's Marley," she said. "He's nice." Mr. Greeley tapped the side of his nose with a crooked finger. "Funny thing," he said. "I saw him run into my garage earlier. Must have slipped through when I opened the door." "What?" I asked, confused. "You have him?" He nodded. "Yup. I've got him in there now. Poor thing looked hungry. Why don't you two come on in and help me get him out?" Rachel grabbed my arm. "We're not supposed to go into anyone's house," she said quickly. Mr. Greeley chuckled. "Well, I'm not just anyone. Ask your grandma. She knows me. I've lived here longer than anyone on this block." I looked at Rachel. She was already shaking her head. "Come on," he said, his smile faltering. "You don't want the dog to stay stuck in there, do you?" Rachel stepped back, pulling me with her. "We'll tell his owner," she said. "They'll come get him." Then she turned us both around, and we walked away. I glanced over my shoulder once. Mr. Greeley was still standing there, watching us. The smile was gone. That night, Rachel told our grandparents what happened. They exchanged looks, the kind of silent conversation adults have when they don't want to scare you. My grandpa muttered something about keeping your distance, and Grandma told us to always stay on our side of the street. We listened, but Mr. Greeley didn't stop. A few days later, we were playing in the driveway with sidewalk chalk when we heard a voice from across the road. "Hey kids." We looked up. Mr. Greeley was standing beside his mailbox, holding something in his hand. "Got some candy for you," he he said, holding out a small bag. But you gotta come get it. Rachel stood up. No thanks, she said. We're not allowed. It's just a little treat, he said. Won't hurt you. He took a step closer to the curb. Come on, he urged. You don't want it to melt, do you? I looked at Rachel. She was already gathering our chalk and nudging me toward the garage. We didn't say anything. We just went inside and closed the door. A few minutes later, we peeked out the window. He was gone. After that, we avoided going outside when he was on the lawn. If we saw him sitting in his chair, glass in hand, we'd wait until he went back inside. Sometimes, we'd see him watching from behind his blinds. Rachel said he gave her the creeps. I didn't argue. But the scariest moment came near the end of our visit. It was early evening, just before dinner. The sky was turning golden, and the air had cooled after a short storm. Rachel and I had gone out to look for Marley again, our usual routine. We took the long way around the block, walking past his house in case he was outside. We were halfway down the street when we heard someone call out. Hey! Hey, you too! It was Mr. Greeley. He was standing in his front yard, waving frantically. Your dog ran into my backyard, he said. I saw him go through the gate. Come on, I'll show you. Rachel stopped walking. He's lying, she whispered. I looked at her, confused. But what if it's real this time? He said the same thing about his garage, she snapped. He's trying to trick us. Mr. Greeley was getting impatient now. He's back here, he called. You'd better come quick. I took a step forward. Rachel grabbed my arm harder than she ever had before. No, she said, her voice low and urgent. We're going home. Right now. I just want to see if. No, she shouted, loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. You're lying. Mr. Greeley's face changed then. The friendliness evaporated. His mouth flattened into a line, his eyes narrowing behind those thick glasses. You little brat, he hissed. You think you know everything? He took a step toward us. Rachel didn't wait. She yanked my hand and we ran. We didn't stop until we were inside, the door locked behind us. We told our grandparents. This time, they didn't just nod. My grandpa walked across the street that night and stood on Mr. Greeley's lawn. I watched through the blinds as they spoke. Mr. Greeley gestured a lot, waving his arms. My grandpa didn't flinch. He just pointed a finger at him, then turned and walked back home. We didn't see Mr. Greeley again for the rest of the visit. Years passed. We stopped spending summers in Florida once our grandparents moved closer to us. Life changed. We grew up. The memory faded, like most childhood fears do. But one day, when I was in college, my mom mentioned something over dinner. Did you hear about the old man from the neighborhood in Florida? She asked. Mr. Greeley? He died last week. Rachel and I exchanged a glance. What happened? I asked. Natural causes, she said. He'd been sick for a while. They found him alone in his house. I nodded and didn't say anything. Later that night, I looked him up. There was no obituary. No photo. Just a short notice in a local paper. Frederick Greeley, 82, passed away in his home. No surviving family. That was it. This happened when I was around 7, maybe 8 years old. My sister, Lauren, was a couple of years older than I was, and we were visiting our grandparents during our summer break. They lived in a quiet suburb just outside of Spokane, Washington, a peaceful place with neatly trimmed hedges, lots of old oak trees, and neighbors who smiled at you on the sidewalk. It was the kind of town where nothing ever seemed out of place. My grandparents had lived in the same house for over 20 years, and it was one of those neighborhoods where everyone knew each other's names. Their house sat on a corner lot, and the backyard opened up to a narrow alley that led to a few other homes. One of those houses belonged to an older man and his wife. He was rail-thin, with sunken cheeks and wispy white hair. I don't remember ever seeing him smile. His wife was just as quiet. We'd occasionally catch glimpses of her tending to the garden or sweeping the front porch, but she never waved or said hello. Sometimes we'd see her peering through the hedge as Lauren and I played in the backyard. There were rumors about them, mostly spread by neighborhood kids. That the man walked around late at night muttering to himself. That he collected things, old dolls, broken toys, and stored them in boxes in the garage. That he had once been caught trying to lure a kid off their bike with promises of candy. I didn't believe those stories at first. They sounded like the kind of spooky tales kids told to scare each other. But as the days wore on, I began to feel like something was wrong. The first time I met him was by accident. Lauren and I were walking home from the corner store a few blocks away. We had gone there to buy popsicles with the loose change our grandpa gave us. It was a warm afternoon, and we were in no rush to get home. On the way back, we decided to take the alley that ran behind some of the houses. It was a shortcut to the backyard. That's when we heard the gravel crunching behind us. I turned around and saw the old man's car slowly rolling down the alley. It was a rust-red station wagon that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. The man was sitting behind the wheel, his pale eyes fixed on us. There was something hollow about his gaze, like he was looking through us instead of at us. I nudged Lauren and whispered, "That's him." She looked over her shoulder and frowned. "Let's just keep walking," she said. But then Jeremy, in his infinite wisdom, decided to wave at the car and shout, "Hey, creepy man." I stared at him in disbelief. "Why would you do that?" "I dunno. It was funny." It wasn't funny. Not even close. The car suddenly braked, did a sharp U-turn, and started heading back toward us. "Run!" Lauren shouted. We sprinted the rest of the way down the alley, cutting through the backyard and bursting into the garage where our mom was unloading groceries. She hadn't seen what happened, but the fear on our faces must have told her everything she needed to know. She pulled us inside and locked the door. From the kitchen window, I saw the man's car inch slowly past the house, then disappear around the corner. That night, we couldn't sleep. Every little noise made my heart pound. Lauren pushed her dresser in front of the window. I made sure the door was locked 3 times. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both knew. He knew where we lived now. 2 weeks later, he was arrested. We heard about it through the neighborhood gossip mill. Apparently, he had cornered a woman in the parking lot of the local hardware store and made lewd comments. She called the police, and they found him lurking near the dumpsters with a bag full of questionable items: candy, rope, and an old camera. He was taken in, but just like before, nothing stuck. He had some kind of explanation for everything. The charges didn't hold, and he was released. And like a bad dream, he came back. He returned to the same house with his wife, who still tended the hedges like nothing had happened. He still drove the same rusty car. And he still stared at us when we played in the yard. Only now we stayed inside more. We kept the curtains pulled, and only went out when our grandparents were with us. It wasn't fear that kept us in, it was the uncertainty. We didn't know what he was capable of, and no one else seemed to know either. But the worst moment came a few days before we were supposed to go back home. I was in the backyard alone, looking for frogs near the pond. Lauren was inside, helping our grandma with dinner. It was just before sunset, and the sky was painted orange and pink. That's when I heard someone call my name. "Matthew," a voice said softly from the other side of the fence. "Come here, I want to show you something." I froze. The voice came again, a little louder now. "Matthew, I have something for you. Some candy. It's in my garage." I slowly backed away from the fence. My heart was thudding so hard I thought it might burst. Then, just as I turned to run, Lauren appeared at the door. "Matt, dinner." I bolted to her without looking back. That night, I told our grandparents everything. They listened quietly, exchanging glances that said more than their words. Our grandpa got up, walked to the garage, and returned with a padlock. He installed it on the back gate that led to the alley. The man never came near again, at least not that we saw. I was 11 years old when I learned that some jokes aren't funny once you understand the weight they carry. It was the summer before middle school, and I was spending the weekend at my best friend Tyler's house. His family lived on the edge of a small town in upstate New York, the kind of place where the sidewalks disappeared after a few blocks and the woods crept right up to the backyards. The town was built around a single main street with a diner, a hardware store, and a gas station that still had a mechanical bell that rang when you drove over the hose. Tyler and I had been inseparable for most of the school year. We rode the same bus, played the same video games, and both had a fascination with anything that felt even remotely dangerous. Abandoned buildings, sewer tunnels, the idea of getting chased by something unknown. We were just kids, looking for something to break the boredom. That summer weekend, Tyler introduced me to a game he and a few other neighborhood boys had made up. They called it Mop. The premise was simple and dumb, as most of the things we did were. You'd hide behind the bushes along the narrow trail that ran from the woods to the street, wait for someone to walk by, then jump out and scream MOP at the top of your lungs. The louder and more sudden, the better. Bonus points if the person screamed or dropped something. We thought it was hilarious. Tyler lived in a cul-de-sac with a small patch of woods behind his backyard. The trail that cut through the trees led to a footbridge, which connected to the middle school on the other side. People used it all the time, joggers, dog walkers, kids on bikes. It was the perfect spot for our stupid game. That afternoon, we were crouched behind a row of overgrown shrubs near the edge of the trail. It was hot, the kind of sticky heat that made your shirt cling to your back and your hair feel like a warm helmet. Tyler had a bottle of warm orange soda, and we were passing it back and forth, whispering and giggling each time we saw someone in the distance. We scared a few people, an old man with a cane who muttered something under his breath, a couple walking a golden retriever, and a teenage girl who screamed and then flipped us off. We thought we were kings. Then, from the bend in the trail, a man appeared. He was tall, taller than my dad, and his clothes looked like they hadn't been washed in a while. His shirt was tattered and hung off his frame like it didn't belong to him. He wore a heavy coat, even though it was nearly 90 degrees out, and his hair was long, greasy, and clinging to the sides of his face. He had a backpack slung over one shoulder and a plastic bag in the other hand. He had the unmistakable look of someone who had been sleeping outside. I didn't say anything. Something about him made my instincts go quiet. But Tyler grinned. "Watch this," he whispered. I opened my mouth to say something, maybe to suggest we skip this one, but before I could, Tyler leapt from the bushes and screamed, "MOP, you smelly freak!" The man stopped dead in his tracks. For a second, he didn't move. Just stood there, staring at us. His eyes were bloodshot, and there was a twitch in his jaw like he was chewing on nothing. The bag in his hand dropped to the ground, landing with a soft thud. Then he started walking toward us. Not fast, not at first. But there was something in the way he moved that made my throat go dry. Deliberate. Steady. Like he had all the time in the world. "Run," I said. Tyler hesitated for a second, then turned and bolted. I followed. We ran up the incline behind his house, ducking between trees, our sneakers slipping on pine needles and loose dirt. I didn't look back at first. I just ran. My heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it in my ears, louder than the sound of my own feet. When we reached his backyard, Tyler turned to me and said, "He's probably gone." I turned around. He wasn't. The man had followed us out of the woods and was now standing on the edge of the grass, just beyond the tree line. He didn't say anything. He didn't yell. He just stood there, shoulders heaving slightly, eyes fixed on us. And then he moved again. This time faster. We ran for the back door. Tyler fumbled with the sliding glass door handle, yelling for his mom. I turned just in time to see the man trip over a tree root, falling to one knee, then stumbling forward onto his hands. It bought us a few precious seconds. The door opened, and we tumbled inside. Tyler's mom was in the kitchen, halfway through making a batch of lemonade. She stared at us, shocked. "What happened to you two?" Tyler tried to explain, but the words came out in a tangled mess. I went to the window. The man was gone. We called his dad, who was at work. He came home early and walked the perimeter of the house, checking the backyard, the side of the garage, even the woods. There was no sign of the man. Tyler's parents didn't call the police. They said there was nothing to report. It was probably just a homeless guy looking for a place to rest, his dad said. You shouldn't have messed with him. We didn't argue. But that night, while Tyler slept, I stayed awake in my sleeping bag on the floor of his room, staring at the ceiling. I couldn't shake the image of the man's face, how blank it had been until the moment Tyler yelled. Then how quickly it had changed. How fast he had moved once we turned our backs. I'd never been that close to danger before. And I'd never been the one to provoke it. Looking back now, as an adult, I understand more than I did then. The man on the trail wasn't just a target for a stupid game. He was a person. Probably someone who'd been through more than I could ever imagine. Hunger. Cold. Rejection. Maybe even violence. And we treated him like a punchline. Of course, none of that excuses what happened. He chased us. He crossed a line. But so did we. That summer ended like all summers do, quietly, without ceremony. Tyler and I drifted apart after middle school. Different interests, different friends. I don't think we ever talked about that day again. At least not out loud. But I carried it with me. I spent a few years living in the heart of Montreal during my early 20s. It was one of those fast-paced chapters of life most people go through. Tight budgets, unpredictable roommates, and a lot of takeout dinners eaten cross-legged on the floor. My apartment was a tiny studio nestled at the end of a hallway on the third floor of a building that had clearly seen better decades. The unit was barely large enough to stretch out in. I had a twin bed pushed up against the wall and a compact desk crammed in next to it. The kitchenette was part of the same room, and the bathroom was the only space with a door that actually closed. The main window overlooked an alley that always smelled faintly of garbage and exhaust. But the rent was cheap, and it was walking distance to the metro and my job at a small print shop downtown. Life there was simple. I had no illusions about the building. It was old, noisy, and a little grimy. Tenants came and went frequently. Some were international students, others short-term workers, and a handful of folks who had clearly been there forever. You learned to keep your head down, lock your door, and not get too involved in anyone else's business. Most of the time, that worked just fine. But then there was Fred. Fred lived at the end of the hall in apartment 3C, directly across from the stairwell. I first noticed him not long after moving in. He was tall, well over 6 feet, and had the kind of bad posture that made him seem smaller than he was. His back was perpetually hunched, and he walked with a slow, shuffling gait like he carried the weight of something heavy every time he moved. He had long, wiry gray hair that hung past his shoulders and a thick, bushy beard that looked unwashed. Most days, he wore the same flannel shirt over a stained white t-shirt, paired with old jeans and sneakers that had seen too many winters. We met briefly during one of my first weeks in the building. I'd been collecting my mail from the front lobby and turned to find him standing behind me, silently waiting his turn. I gave a polite nod and said, "Hi, I'm from 3G, trying to break the awkward silence." He didn't respond immediately. He just stared at me, as if he was trying to figure out whether I was worth acknowledging. Finally, he grunted, "Fred," and brushed past me without another word. That was the beginning and end of our first exchange. After that, I saw him now and then, usually late at night when he was dragging a heavy-looking duffel bag up the stairs or standing in the hallway, muttering to himself. He always seemed to wear the same expression, blank, lifeless, with eyes that never really settled on one thing. I didn't give it much thought at first. Like I said, the building had its share of oddballs. But then, a few months in, something strange happened. It was a quiet Sunday evening, and I was sitting at my desk working on a freelance project. The light from my laptop was the only illumination in the room. Outside, snow was starting to fall, and the building was unusually still. Suddenly, I heard footsteps in the hallway. That wasn't unusual. People walked past my door all the time, but this time, the steps stopped directly in front of my unit. I paused, listening. Then, the doorknob began to rattle. It wasn't subtle. Someone was actively trying to open my door. The handle turned once, twice, and then a hard push followed. I froze. Luckily, I had locked it earlier that evening. The person on the other side must have realized it was secure because, after a few seconds, the noise stopped. I slowly crept to the peephole and looked out. No one. Cautiously, I cracked the door open just an inch and peered down the hallway. Fred was walking away, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his back to me. I shut the door and locked it again. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I mentioned the incident to one of the other tenants, a woman named Ivy who lived 2 doors down. "Fred," she said, her eyes narrowing. "Yeah, he's done that before." "What do you mean?" "He tries doors. Sees if anyone forgot to lock up. A few people have caught him doing it. He never takes anything as far as I know, but, creepy. Has anyone reported it?" She shook her head. "Not really. He's been here forever. Doesn't talk to anyone. The landlord won't do anything unless something actually happens." I felt a knot form in my stomach. I'd assumed it was a one-time thing, a moment of confusion. But it wasn't. This was a pattern. After that, I started noticing more signs. Sometimes I'd hear soft footsteps outside my door late at night. Other times, I'd wake up with the feeling that someone had been near. Once, I found a long scratch on the wood of my door, right near the handle. I couldn't prove anything, but I didn't need to. I started keeping a chair in front of my door at night. It wasn't much, but it gave me a little peace of mind. I never confronted Fred. I didn't even speak to him again. But I watched him. I watched the way he would linger in the hallway, listening at doors. I watched how he'd wait until the building was quiet before coming out of his unit. One night, I couldn't sleep. I was sitting up in bed, reading, when I heard something outside. I turned off my light and crept to the door. Through the peephole, I saw Fred standing at my neighbor's door, hand on the knob. He twisted it slowly, pulled, then let go. He did the same to the next door down. I wanted to call the police. I even picked up my phone. But what would I say? That a guy was turning doorknobs? That he hadn't actually broken in? I knew the answer. So I waited. And I watched. Eventually, he disappeared into the stairwell, and the hallway was quiet again. I started warning new tenants when they moved in. "Make sure you lock your door," I'd say. Seriously. Don't forget. Some took me seriously. Others didn't. After about a year, Fred stopped appearing as often. I think complaints had finally caught up with him. Or maybe he just got tired. One day, I saw movers outside the building, and by that evening, Fred's door was wide open, the apartment inside empty. He was gone. I stayed in that building for another year, but it never felt quite the same. The memory of those late-night rattles and the duffel bag dragging down the hall stayed with me. I still sleep with my bedroom door closed and a chair in front of the front door, even in my new place. I was around 11 when it happened. We'd lived in a middle-class neighborhood in a small town called Bramble Hill, a quiet place in southern Ontario where everyone knew everyone else. Our street had a cul-de-sac at the end, and the houses were mostly bungalows with big front lawns and well-kept gardens. Life was simple then: school, homework, and playing with my younger brother, Jeremy, who was 9 at the time. Our grandparents lived just a few blocks away, and we visited them often. They had a beige brick house with a backyard full of lilacs and a swing set that had long since rusted, but we still used it anyway. That day, Jeremy and I had walked over after school to help our grandma make dumplings. Our mom had offered to drive us home later, but we wanted to walk. It was a warm day in early spring, and the sidewalks had just dried from the last snowfall. That walk home changed everything. We left our grandparents' house just before 5 p.m. The sky was still bright, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth and leftover salt from the roads. Jeremy and I were chatting about his school project, something about dinosaurs, and laughing about how he'd accidentally glued his sleeve to the poster. We turned the corner into our cul-de-sac, and that's when I first noticed the car. It was a faded silver sedan, maybe a late 90s model, with rust spots near the wheel wells. It drove slowly past us, then turned at the end of the cul-de-sac and came back the way it came. I didn't think much of it at first. People got lost all the time in our neighborhood because the streets looped in strange ways. But there was something odd about the way the driver looked at us. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just stared. "Hey," I whispered to Jeremy. "That's the guy people have been talking about." Jeremy looked at me, his eyes widening. "The one who got caught looking in windows?" I nodded. We had heard plenty of stories from other kids, and even some adults. There was a man everyone was uneasy about. He lived at the far end of the next street over, in a one-story house with peeling paint and a sagging porch. He lived there with his father, apparently, and people said he'd been arrested several times for things like trespassing and disturbing the peace. Rumor had it he'd been caught peeking into windows, mostly at night, and had once even tried opening someone's back door. But nothing had ever stuck, and he always ended up back home. I don't know what got into Jeremy. Maybe it was nervous energy, or maybe he was just trying to act tough. But as the car drove by again, he shouted something. "Hey, freak!" The words were sharp, loud, and unmistakable. "Jeremy!" I hissed, elbowing him. "What are you doing?" He grinned like it was no big deal, but I could already feel the panic rising in my chest. I looked back. The car had slowed down. The brake lights flickered on. Then it turned around again. "He's coming back," I said, grabbing Jeremy's hand. "Run." We bolted down the sidewalk. Our house was just a few doors away, and our mom's car was in the driveway. I prayed she'd be inside and not out back. We turned into our driveway just as the car crept up to the curb. I didn't dare look behind me. "Mom!" I screamed. "Mom!" She was in the garage, sorting recycling. She hadn't seen us yet. She looked up just as we ran in, her face contorting with confusion. "What's going on?" "There's a man." I panted. "He's following us." She pulled us behind her, her eyes scanning the street. The car had stopped at the end of the driveway, its engine idling. Then slowly, it turned and rolled out of the cul-de-sac, disappearing the same way it came. We stood there in silence, all of us breathing hard. Eventually, my mom walked us inside, locked the door, and made sure every window was shut. That night, we closed all the blinds by 6 p.m. and pushed furniture in front of the door. Even Jeremy, who usually laughed at scary movies, was quiet. He sat on the couch next to me, clutching a pillow. We didn't sleep much that night. 2 weeks passed. During that time, we didn't see the man again. But the rumors picked up. Someone said he'd been seen walking through backyards at night. Another person claimed he'd followed a woman home from the grocery store. The police had been called, but without proof, nothing could be done. Then, one afternoon, we heard he'd been arrested. Apparently, he'd been caught harassing a woman in the parking lot of a Walmart on the east side of town. He'd followed her to her car and tried to block her from leaving. She screamed, and a bystander intervened. Police were called. He was taken away. Everyone in our neighborhood breathed a sigh of relief. But he came back. It was almost exactly a year later. The charges hadn't stuck. He was back in that sagging little house with his father. His car was still parked outside, same faded silver sedan, same rust spots. And just like before, we started seeing him again. Not every day. Just now and then. Sometimes he'd be standing in his driveway, smoking a cigarette, staring down the street. Other times we'd see his car doing slow loops around the block. No one wanted to say anything. It was like if we didn't acknowledge it, it wouldn't be real. But it was. My mom kept us inside more often. Jeremy and I stopped walking home from school. We didn't go to the park alone anymore. I kept my curtains drawn, even during the day. And every time I walked past my window, I felt like he was still watching. The worst part? We never got closure. There was no final confrontation. No second arrest. No dramatic event to end it all. He was just there. And then one day he wasn't. I don't know if he moved away again or if something else happened. But he vanished. His car disappeared. His house went dark. For weeks we waited for him to return, but he never did. The neighborhood slowly relaxed. Parents let their kids play outside again. We started walking to our grandparents' place without fear. But the feeling never completely went away, not for me. I moved out of my parents' house a little later than most of my friends. I grew up in Toronto in a family that still held on to many of our old traditions from our roots in Moldova. My parents had moved to Canada when I was just a baby, but their values came with them. My dad in particular had a hard time with the idea of me, his only daughter, living on my own. It took a lot of negotiation, late-night talks, and finally, a secure job offer before he agreed. At 25, I finally moved into my own apartment. It was a modest one-bedroom on the 14th floor of a twin high-rise complex in the west end of the city. The buildings were nearly identical, tall, concrete, and just a little past their prime. They stood at the edge of a busy transit hub, and from my balcony, I could see the endless traffic winding down the 401. Not exactly picturesque, but it felt like freedom. The apartment wasn't huge, but it was mine. The kitchen was small but functional, and the bedroom had a large window that let in a surprising amount of light. The living room opened onto the balcony, which was separated from the next unit by a thick concrete barrier. The railing was glass and aluminum, and although I was high up, I occasionally went out there to read or drink coffee when the weather was nice. What I appreciated most was the sense of anonymity. Although the buildings were packed with tenants, most people kept to themselves. I liked that. I introduced myself to a few neighbors during that first week. Young professionals mostly, some students, and a couple of older retired folks. Everyone was friendly in passing, but no one overstepped. It felt like a good fit. Everyone, that is, except for my next-door neighbor. His name was Darren. He was probably in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, though his clothes made it a little difficult to tell. He wore backward baseball caps like he was still in high school and favored tank tops, even in cooler weather. He was stocky, with a thick build and a dark, scruffy beard. The first time we met was in the hallway, just a day after I moved in. I had just come back from the grocery store, arms full of bags, when he stepped out of his unit at the same moment. He offered to help me carry my things, but I politely declined. That didn't stop him from lingering. He introduced himself and asked if I wanted to grab a drink sometime. I kept my response cordial but firm. Thanks, but I'm just getting settled right now. He gave me a slow nod, like he didn't quite believe me. No worries, he said, but his eyes stayed on me a little too long. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was just awkward. Over the next few weeks, our paths crossed more than I would have liked. It was always in passing, at the elevators, in the lobby, or outside the building. But it was too frequent to be a coincidence. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. We lived next to each other, after all. Random encounters were bound to happen. But the timing of those encounters started to feel too precise. There were moments when I would hear my door click shut, and within seconds, Darren would appear in the hallway, acting surprised to see me. Heading out? He'd ask with a grin. I'd nod and keep walking, rarely saying more than a word or two. I began to suspect that he was listening for me through the wall, waiting for the sound of activity, so he could run into me. My apartment had thin walls. I could hear when he played music or dropped something heavy, so it wouldn't be hard for him to hear my movements too. It got to the point that I adjusted my routine. I'd wait by the peephole to make sure the coast was clear before leaving. I started using headphones in the hallway, so I wouldn't have to talk to him. I kept the balcony door locked, just in case. I even started sleeping with my bedroom door closed, something I'd never done before. Still, I didn't think I had any real reason to be afraid. He hadn't done anything overtly threatening. Just unsettling. Then one night, everything changed. It was a chilly Monday evening in late October. I was exhausted from work and had gone to bed early, probably around 9:30. I remember falling asleep quickly, still in sweatpants, with the sound of traffic humming in the background. The apartment was dark and quiet. I don't know what woke me. A sound, a shift in the air, a feeling. I was somewhere between dreaming and waking when I sensed something was off. My skin prickled. I opened my eyes and sat up, heart pounding. The room was pitch black. I reached across the bed for my phone and tapped the screen to check the time. It was just after 2 a.m. I activated the flashlight app and swept the beam around the room. Nothing. I was about to lie back down when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of my front door slamming shut. For a second, I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my mind trying to process what I'd just heard. Then I jumped up, heart hammering, and ran to the door. It was locked, but the damage was done. Someone had been in my apartment. I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to understand. I looked through the peephole, then quickly turned off the flashlight and pressed my ear to the door. A few seconds later, I heard another door slam, the one next to mine. Darren's door. I didn't need to see him. I knew. I called my parents first. They were half asleep, but immediately told me to go stay with them. I packed a small bag and left the apartment without even bothering to change out of my pajamas. I didn't care who saw me. At their place, I explained everything. My dad was furious. My mom was pale and quiet. We didn't sleep that night. The next morning, we went back to the apartment together. Darren's door was shut. My dad knocked once hard. No answer. We went inside my place, and I checked every room, every drawer, every window. Nothing appeared to be stolen. Nothing was obviously disturbed. But something had happened. I couldn't prove it, not yet. There were no cameras in the hallways. The building had security, but it was minimal and mostly for show. I didn't report it to the police, mostly because I didn't know what I could say. A guy I think is creepy might have been in my apartment, wouldn't get me very far. Still, I knew I couldn't stay. I decided to move out. I broke the lease early and paid the penalty. My dad helped me find a new place closer to their home, and I moved out within the week. I didn't even see Darren again during the move. He never knocked on my door. Never said goodbye. I half wonder if he knew I was on to him. Later, I realized how he must have gotten in. The sliding glass door to the balcony had been unlocked. I never bothered locking it because we were on the 14th floor. Who would climb across a concrete divide between balconies to break in? Apparently Darren would. After that, I made a point to always lock windows and doors no matter what floor I lived on.